Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here on the floor today to speak in favor of the pending business before the Senate to allow for Montenegro to join NATO as a new member. I've been a proponent of this move for a long time, having spent time in Montenegro, having chaired for a period of time the Europe Subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee, now serving with Senator Johnson as his ranking member. I'm convinced that NATO will be stronger if Montenegro joins. I'm convinced that our alliance will be stronger if Montenegro joins. It's a small country with a very small military, but it occupies an incredibly important space on the world map. It is the only part of the Adriatic coast that breaks up the current NATO map, and it will provide a strengthening of our alliance in that region. Montenegro is ready. They've made significant progress on internal reform, especially in the area of rule of law and security sector reform. The Ministry of Defense has met all of the requirements for NATO membership. It's moving to modernize its military. It's moving to try to operationalize itself in a way that it can interact with both the U.S. and European equipment. It's replacing its aircraft that previously had required Russian spare parts so that they are more compatible with European and American air equipment. There's still work that Montenegro needs to do, but now it can continue under the umbrella of the alliance. So I'm very happy that we are taking an important step here to signal that the open door policy of NATO is still in practice. I think there was some doubt, frankly, after years and years of Montenegro's desire to join. Amidst both the interest from Georgia and prior to the crisis in Ukraine to join, there was some concern that some of these transatlantic institutions were closing down. And this is a sign that NATO is still not only viable, but is still open to those countries who want to join, who want to find additional safety and security under our umbrella. And I'm glad that we're going to have a bipartisan vote here in favor of Montenegro joining NATO. But I want to make a broader point, Mr. President, about our future policy in the Balkans. You know, it wasn't that long ago when it was a precondition, if you were a member of Congress, to be an expert in the Balkans. The U.S. was at war in the Balkans, as was Russia, as were our European allies. It was the hottest spot in the globe, and thanks both to U.S. military might as well as diplomatic might, the Dayton Peace Accords brought peace and relative economic prosperity to a region of the globe that has been, frankly, at the center of almost every major conflict in and around Europe over the greater part of the last 100 years. This is a moment to both celebrate this period of political and security stability in the Balkans, but to remember that we shouldn't take it for granted. There are still festering ethnic and nationalist tensions that play out every day in the Balkans. We see them in small ways. When I was there, a drone dropped down into the middle of a football match between the Serbian national team and the Albanian national team with a map of Greater Albania, which was a deliberate attempt to inflame the Serbians. That seemed like a small thing, but it resulted in the cancellation of a historic meeting between the head of state of Albania and the head of state, the prime ministers of Albania and the prime minister of Serbia. Just recently, we've seen, some breakdown in the progress that Serbia and Kosovo had been making to try to resolve their differences, and resulting ultimately, we hope, we believe, in the recognition of Kosovo statehood by the Serbian government. And so it's a reminder that bringing Montenegro into NATO is important for the alliance's sake, but it's also an important step in continuing to make investments in security in the Balkans. It's important for a second reason, because there's another player out there that is desperately trying to make the Balkans less stable, and that is Russia. Russia has, for a very long time, had legitimate interests in the Balkans, right? They have relations with the people of Balkan nations as well as those governments. But they have an interest today in trying to destabilize that region, to create a crisis for Europe, to create a crisis for NATO. And as we all know, Russia fills vacuums of power better than almost any other player out there. And whether we like it or not, as members of the Senate, there is an enormous vacuum in the world right now created by the withdrawal of America. Without a robust State Department, without a coherent U.S. foreign policy, we are just not players in the world today like we were a year ago. And example A may be the Balkan region. The Balkans require attention because there are these simmering potential conflicts, and the U.S. has been a force for good, but in ways that most Americans probably don't even know. It required constant attention from Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Kerry, Assistant Secretary of State Toria Nuland, to make sure that the Balkans, in particular the Western Balkans, continued their move towards Europe and rejected offers from Russia for a different kind of alignment. It was weekly, big and small interventions that have allowed for the Balkan nations to feel comfort in a future with Europe and with the United States. That intervention, that attention, has frankly just disappeared, and the Russians have filled that vacuum. A coup attempt in Montenegro. You don't see a lot of coup attempts these days in countries in and around Europe, but there was an attempt to storm parliament that has been connected back to Russian nationals. Those Russian nationals, according to Montenegro, have connections directly to the Russian government. Now, that hasn't been confirmed yet, but that's incredibly disturbing to know that Russian nationals were behind an attempted military coup inside Montenegro. We've seen a much tighter joining of the leaders of the Republic of Srpska and Russian interests and operatives, a move towards a referendum for independence in the Republic of Srpska, which is a component of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that looks suspiciously like the kind of independence referendums that are threatened to take place in parts of Ukraine, in Luhansk and Donetsk, with reports that the same players who are trying to fund and operationalize independence referendums in Ukraine are also at work inside Serbia, players with connections back to the Kremlin. Reports of a massive increase in Russian media presence in the Balkans. More offers from Russia TV stations and radio stations to provide free content to cash-strapped Balkan media outlets. Over 100 different nonprofit organizations in Serbia alone, according to one report, that have financial connections back in and through Russia. Russia is filling this vacuum in the Balkans, trying to win friends and trying to create instability that ultimately would land at the doorstep of NATO, at the doorstep of Europe, and at the doorstep of the United States. They're filling that vacuum because we don't have a presence there today. Secretary Tillerson has no experience, any meaningful experience in the Balkans. He has no deputy and he has no assistant secretary for the Balkans. And you pair that next to a proposal that Secretary Tillerson endorses to cut his budget by 40%, and you will make America relatively feckless in that region, because it is those funds that the administration is seeking to cut that are often our linkages into influence. In Belgrade, our ambassador has made enormous progress with a small amount of money for exchange programs. You look at people in powerful positions in Serbia today, and many of them are close to the United States because they participated in State Department exchange programs. They spent time here in the United States getting to know our country, maybe getting educated here, and they went back to Serbia to be part of the government to represent Serbian interests, but with a connection to the United States and to the West that was important. Well, those exchange programs are just basically eviscerated by a 40% cut. They won't exist any longer. It's a very small program, but it's gotten not just us important results in the Balkans, but it's contributed to our ability to argue for stability, to argue for the calming of tensions, because it gets doors opened for the United States. So without anybody on call for the State Department in the Balkans, without any funding in order to try to promote stability and economic connections between those countries, we cede ground to Russia every single day. Russia sees vacuums and they fill it, and we have created one. We've created a vacuum globally, but we've created a specific vacuum in the Balkans. Now, it is filled in part by this movement to join Montenegro with NATO. And I do appreciate the fact that Secretary Tillerson, I believe, and Secretary Mattis both recommended to this body that we take up this matter. I think that was important, and I applaud them for standing against the recommendations of the Russian government and for the ascension of Montenegro into NATO. But it's not enough. And so I wanted to come to this floor today, and I see my great friend and colleague from Ohio ready to speak. I wanted to come to this floor to make the case for why this is so important, to make the case that as Russia tries to view Montenegro as an opportunity to establish a Kaliningrad on the Mediterranean, we can prevent that from happening with this vote and with the vote of our European allies to join Montenegro to NATO. But it's not enough. It's not enough. We have to remember that stability in the Balkans is nothing to be taken for granted. And the next global crisis may come from a small act of tension between neighbors that spins out of control, in part because the United States is not paying attention, and because Russian intervention in the region, which is bigger and broader now than ever before, has an interest not in stability, but actually ultimately in instability. So I thank Leader McConnell for bringing this before the body. This is a chance for us to join together in supporting Montenegro as they join NATO, but hopefully there will be more opportunities for us to work together to make sure that this administration, to make sure that our country has a comprehensive policy to continue to build on the Dayton Peace Accords and double down on the work we do to promote long-term stability and prosperity in the Balkan region. I yield the floor.